the paper, the presentation today is about official statistics in Nagaland. So the first question is why, what is so interesting about Nagaland, and what is the particular range of things that we think about in economics into which this description of official statistics in Nagaland fits. So I'll try and suggest that it fits into a particular way of looking at economics. So shall we go to the next slide? Now, first of all, the presentation is based on a book which contains not just statistics about Nagaland, but a lot about India. And that makes it more interesting because there is a common thread. But the book is very expensive, and Manfred has made it easier for us to look at this paper free by publishing the chapter on Nagaland in Munich Social Science Review. But the whole point is the paper and the book is that there is a wider relevance. There may be other relevance that Vikas had in mind, but to me, it's a discourse on national and group identity. As you listen to him, you'll see how the statistics are manipulated in the way that particular discourse can take place. And of course, the whole question then is why and how people think of themselves as being Naga or a particular tribe within Naga, or even about Indian. Now, shall we go to the next slide? Now, if we click on that YouTube channel, and you'll see what the wider issue is and why this particular problem that Vikas raises in the book, either intentionally or accidentally, is so important in the context of India, and I think in the context of economics as a whole.
But after all, how would you define an Indian? An Indian is one who is not understood by most. An Indian is one who is said dead wearing the clothes of another Indian. An Indian is one who finds most of the food of other Indians indigestible. An Indian is one who doesn't dance the same dances as others and doesn't sing the same songs as others. And the chances are that an Indian is one whose religion is not the same as that of another. Certainly an Indian is one whose color is not the same as another Indian and whose race is not the same as another Indian. Now, in this amazing diversity, how do you succeed in being Indian? What is an Indian? Well, my provisional answer is an Indian is one who accepts that anyone who calls himself an Indian is an Indian.
Okay, we stop now. There's literature, not just in economics, and trying to grapple with the concept of identity in India, but there is literature which grapples with the concept of identity even elsewhere. And one of the more interesting books I found, which tried to define an Indian, was Nehru's book, Discovery of India. Now, today's lecture is more focused on one aspect of that issue. It's about rent-seeking, expenditure on resources in pursuit of identity. Different groups in India spend resources in trying to define themselves as a particular subgroup. Now, why they do that? Well, there is obviously what Vikas suggests, that there is a potential rent. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, there are a number of ways that we can look at the concept of identity. And I've just mentioned three non-exclusive frameworks of analysis, but there may be more. I've not looked at this literature for almost 2 decades now. But there was quite a lot of literature that was coming out when I last looked at it, and I could put them in three categories. First is the neoclassical approach, calculation of self-interest. And there is the public choice literature on rent to be obtained from identity. And today's lecture is a bit like that. But then the second, which is not completely contradictory to the first, is that we define our identity by imagining something, some kind of a selective remembrance of a collective past. Now, how that came about, we'll come to in a minute. And then there is a third way of looking at it. These are theoretical framework, that there is some kind of a social capital which internalizes externalities if we define ourselves as a group. And then that's one of the reasons why clubs, culture, nationality, all these things emerge. And that's a line of argument which about 20 years ago I noticed was gaining a lot of traction. So shall we get to the next page, please? So this is the first way of looking at it. It is the individuals as maximizing automatons. And they look at their identity as a source of rent. Now, if we... So economists define rent quite... It's a way of... It's expenditure of resources to capture the process by which resources are allocated. So it's an expenditure of resources to capture, for instance, government decisions about how resources are allocated. Next bit, please. And I've chosen a definition from a book which I found very easy to read. So I'm repeating myself there. This is something André Breton, who wrote a paper in Journal of Political Economy in 1964 on this. For a nationalist, the claim to nationality or ethnicity or whatever, or a group, is to stake a claim on the wealth of that group, share of the wealth of that group. Now, about that time, Harry Johnson, who was, of course, some people probably remember him as a macroeconomist, and he has also written on trade theory. And from the trade theorist's point of view, he tried to understand why people define themselves as being a particular nationality or whatever. Is there some kind of an advantage to be had, some kind of a rent to be sought in trade negotiations? Now, these are just some arbitrary, not arbitrary, some important references, but not exhaustive references. So shall we get to the next page, please? Now, the imagined communities. That's one of the books where I think that term was first used, but I may be wrong. That I came across that term in Benedict Anderson's book on imagined communities. He had lots of arguments about how nationalism developed. One of those was the death of God. With industrialization, the king, the line of authority through which resources were distributed got broken, because in feudal society, Vikas and Manfred could be very rich and I could be very poor, and the argument would be that that is perfectly legitimate because the king had given them a lot of land and had forgotten to give me any, or perhaps because I was naughty and I wasn't given any. Now, and we'd accept that being perfectly legitimate because the king had a direct line to God. But with Industrial Revolution, that direct line started getting snapped because people started getting rich, who were not quite people who were in the aristocracy. Industrial workers congregated in cities in large numbers where there was no priest, at least per capita availability of priest was much less than it was in their previous society, and therefore there was no one to tell them that their miserable existence was to be accepted because God had indeed, through the king, had divined that that should be so. So is some other form of legitimacy about our distribution of income, wealth, and also legitimacy of being came about. And that is what Anderson calls that we began to imagine ourselves in something in a different way than we had done before. Now, an interesting case study of that I came across in a book by Gwyn Williams, an historian, who wrote a book called When Was Wales? He traces the development of Welsh nationalism through economic changes, as population got replaced, as people left and different types of people came, and how different parts of the country developed a different view of what being a Welsh person was going to be. Now, in the context of some of the developing economies, I also came across a very good book by Partha Chatterjee, published by Princeton some 20 years ago, where he actually, although he says he disagrees with Benedict Anderson, he actually doesn't disagree. He just produces a different way of how people came to imagine themselves as being a nation in the post-colonial societies, because many of the borders and so forth were quite arbitrary. How do you become a Chinese when China was, if you go back in history, it was not quite the same territory as it is now? How do you consider yourself an Indian when, I mean, much of what territories in India were not even fully integrated into recent history of India, into British India? And Nagaland is, of course, one of those where it was part of India, I believe, but it's very loosely connected to the definition of India. Now, there is a literature on this by historians, but as I said, there's economic arguments that are made in the story, in the historical stories that are told. May I go back to the and of course these things worry people. Some of these explanations look quite plausible and sometimes quite good, but the very fact of these discussions about imagined communities and so forth, some kind of a selective recollection of a collective past as to how wonderful our parents and grandparents were when in fact they were killing each other's neighbors. Eric Hobsbawm, amongst others, have cited note of caution that if you go down that road, you can run into mysticism and fascism. It's something that some people are bothered about. In fact, last week, Ari Hillman told us, well, when you start talking about culture and so forth, be careful how you talk about it. It may be perfectly sensible, but be careful. These things can lead to mysticism. Okay, may I get to the next page, please? I mentioned a lot of names. Because I mentioned them, I've just given the references to what it is that I read, which I'm citing now. Now, this is only useful for people who wish to pursue this, and if you write to me, I can send you a page, that particular page. Now, the next page, please. Of course, now the most important part, the introduction of the authors. It's a joint author work by Ankush Agrawal and Vikas Kumar. They teach at two different universities, but I believe they may have done their PhD at the same place in Bombay. They do have a shared interest on research and use of Indian data. I came across Ankush Agrawal's work in a different context some time ago. What he uses, of course, he doesn't just collect and analyzes and finds problems of how to make the data more reliable. He also uses it in an econometric exercise that he did, but who gains more for education? Of course, to me, it was interesting because being associated with university, of course, I believe that educational expenditure should all be directed to universities, preferably to my university. But I mean, as an economist, you have to say, well, what are the relative gains of individuals and society in the way we distribute education? Shall we spend more money on primary education rather than on secondary education? Or shall we spend more money on University College London rather than on the LSE? These are, of course, issues that we have to look at more carefully. So I came across that paper some time ago, and I found it quite interesting, although a bit challenging about some of the views that he expresses, but that's a different matter. So let's go back to the speaker today. I'll spend a bit more time simply because he's the speaker and also because I've met him when he was in Hamburg. Now, he's a polymath. He actually went to one of the top engineering universities in India and was an engineer by training and worked in the electrical engineering industry in a large firm. And then I do not know what happened, what possessed him to become an economist. He then retrained as an economist, did a PhD. During the process, he spent a year in Hamburg in the law and economics department when, in one of my visits to Hamburg, I met him. And then he went back to India. He taught at the National Law School, and now he teaches at a school which is founded by the founder of an IT company called Wipro. I did not know that the founder was apparently a very visionary person. Bill Gates says that he never did anything without consulting the company Wipro. And when Gerhard Schroeder went to India, first thing he did when he met industrialists was to go and go to that particular company and meet the founder. So Vikas is in a very important place, teaches in a place which has an interesting antecedent. Now, I think I've taken up quite a lot of your time, and I've also given a twist to Vikas's lecture, which may not necessarily be the twist that he wishes to pursue. So let's listen to him. I'll stop now.
Good evening to everyone. I'm very grateful to Professor Holar for inviting me and Professor Shanti Chakrabarti for giving a very generous introduction. When I began preparing the slides for this lecture, for this presentation, I steered away slightly from the outline that Professor Chakrabarti had given. So I bring in more of my more recent work, and so it'll be a mix of the book as well as my current work. So I'm going to talk about numbers as political allies. If we see, but before that, I should say that a very large proportion of economic analysis or discussions these days are driven by statistics which economists do not collect on their own. And the understanding of these statistics is often found to be problematic, especially in the context of developing countries. So I'm going to give you examples from India, and let me first, explain what I mean by periphery. Right. So if you think from the colonial perspective, the fertile plains were the core of the colony, and these were surrounded by loosely controlled frontiers. The frontiers were in turn surrounded by buffer states and protectorates, which were followed by spheres of influence and spheres of interest. We are going to focus our discussion to the frontier zones. Right? Now, in my work, in book as well as elsewhere, I show that the quality of map statistics and metadata decline both in colonial as well as post-colonial period when we go from the colony towards, towards the frontier. Now we can think of frontier in very different ways apart from this colonial perspective. We can also think of frontier as an ethnic periphery, right? Where if you see, you can see it from linguistic perspective, from the perspective of tribes, and from the perspective of minority religions. You will see that the darker areas which indicate, states which are distant from the mainstream in terms of identity. Most of them are concentrated in either in the northeastern part of the country or in the northwestern part of the country. So this is northwestern part, this is northeastern part, right? You can also think of periphery from a statistical perspective. So these are areas where census could not be conducted in one of the decades, or census was conducted in a difficult circumstances, or the data were not, or the entire data were not published after the census was conducted. You again find a similar pattern when you look at national sample surveys. These are the areas where survey where there were large coverage errors. Then your national population register, once again you see the same areas, right? And finally the latest digital identity database. So you see, if you take an intersection of these four maps, and you'll see that they have a large overlap with the ethnic periphery, right? We can also think of the periphery from a political or an electoral perspective. Now here, only these peripheral areas account for only 5% of the population and less than 4% of the national income, and about 5% of the parliament seats. If you cannot conduct a survey in these areas, or if the quality of data from the periphery is not satisfactory, it does not really affect the national policy making, right? And additionally, several union laws do not apply to these peripheral areas. So therefore, you don't there's no urgency to collect data on these states, or to fix the data deficit of these states. Now, uh, we can think of the policy periphery, where you see that these peripheral areas are governed by a different physical logic compared to mainstream states, right? So therefore they were called special category states, and federal spending in these areas was governed by ad hoc formulas rather than being determined by statistically based formulas, right? Or we can also just to give you a last snapshot about periphery. These are the areas where the central government could not implement delimitation of constituencies based on head count, right? So it had to either postpone the delimitation for 30 years or implement it with severe constraints, right? So I'm going to talk about these peripheral areas, and the literature about the peripheral the data deficit in the peripheral areas can be summed up with respect using this your diagram. If you have development deficit, there is a lower opportunity cost of disruption and violence, and this contributes to democracy deficit. If you have development deficit, there are socio-economic inequalities, and an unequal society cannot support democracy for a long time. And but if there is democracy deficit, so there is a lack of proper planning, and that affects development. Democracy deficit also disrupts public goods provision, and and government statistics of public goods, and they are affected to that extent. Even if it doesn't disrupt public goods provision, it can physically obstruct collection of data, right? And if there's a democracy deficit, people are uncomfortable sharing their information with institutions which they believe are not accountable to them, right? So this also contributes to data deficit. Then the use of flawed data can lead to unrest, because flawed data will prefer is going to support the claims of one or the other community, and therefore the communities which lose are going to protest, and they will disrupt the usual democratic processes. Now, data deficit can lead to flawed policies, and that contributes to development deficit. But development deficit means that there is lack of resources, and it feeds back into data deficit. More importantly, development deficit could lead to a situation where people manipulate data to capture public resources, right? So we are going to in today I'm going to focus mostly on these aspects where you have some element of conflict and coming and ethnic angle directly involved, right? Now, when we think of conflict and demography, we have different strands in the literature. Huntington, for instance, suggested that youth bulges are associated with conflict, right? And therefore, therefore, changes in or your differences in demographic profiles of countries or societies can or communities can lead to conflict. Horowitz and Anderson suggest that conflict is central to making of the identity. Conflict, a large part of conflict is essentially, to strengthen your own borders, your own community boundaries, right? Then there is a now, but here, and then there is a literature which says that conflict can actually affect fertility, can migration. But this literature is not. I mean, it is interesting and will, intersects with some of my concerns. But I am going to today focus, not focus on these. I'm going to focus on situations where conflict triggers numbers games, right? That is, conflict does not necessarily change fertility or migration, but it affects, how we choose to represent ourselves in government statistics, for instance. So therefore, the numbers change without any actual change on the ground. And this is well captured by Donald Horowitz, who says that in a severely divided society, an election can become an ethnic headcount. A census needs to be won, so the election is a census, and the census is an election. So this conflation between election and census, for instance, is one of the things of interest to us, right? And I have just now, outlined several other linkages between conflict and how headcount are interrelated. So some of these arguments are summarized in the book, but I'm going to go beyond the book today. I'm going to use this opportunity to share some of the emerging thoughts from from my fieldwork across the length and breadth of the ethnic periphery of the country. So I see that after I completed my work in Nagaland, I started working in Assam, Manipur, and Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, and I found a few stylized facts emerged from these field work and archival work. That first of all, there is an irregularity of surveys and censuses in the periphery, right? There are sharp and inexplicable variations in the overall headcount between censuses, right? So, and we'll see examples of these. There are unanticipated and large changes in the estimates of child sex ratio, right? Of migration, of urbanization, and slum population, right? So, and there are counterintuitive changes in the relative shades of communities and regions. And finally, there are large content errors. Content errors are essentially about uh, you can have a perfect census where there's no coverage error, but there are content errors insofar as you misidentify people in the data. So, for instance, Hindus could be recorded as Muslims, or Muslims could be recorded as Hindus, or upper caste and lower caste could be conflated, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing for me is these stylized facts include sharp changes in child sex ratio, migration, urbanization, and slum population, right? And these, again, as I mentioned, are not changes in the actual population, but the way population is estimated or reported in these census and surveys. So I'll give you a few examples from these states. This is Ladakh, this is Jammu and Kashmir, Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, right? So to look at this slide on child sex ratio, the change between 2001 and 2011, 220 points change between these two dates. Actually, I'm saying that this is between 2001 and 2011 because census happens only once in 10 years. If you compare the census with other government sources, this change, this drop in child sex ratio happened between 2009-10 and 2010-11, right? So just within a period of 1 year, there's a 220 point decline in the reported child sex ratio. Now, child sex ratio is female in the 0 to 6 age group and male in the 0 to 6 age group, right? A 220 point decline. This cannot be explained by any demographic factor. Or think of this, you consider this, decline again, 150 point decline in 10 years, right? 150 plus point decline in 10 years. Now, why should communities in conflict, inflate or change the child sex ratio? Now, this is something that I'm going to discuss a little later. Or look at the child population share. You in 1991, the population share is 15% of the population is between 0 to 6. In 2001, it drops sharply to 8.3 and then again rises to 13.0%, right? These changes cannot be explained using any known demographic or other factors which affect population. Or look at the slum population. Now, this is the only district which receives all distress migration, economic migration, educational migration, conflict migration, but the slum population here is decreasing. Experience of democrat of most growing Indian cities which receive economic migrants is that a large part of these migrants settle in slums. So therefore, slum population increases. But here you see a sharp decrease in slum population, whereas the slum population increases in areas which are sources of net out migration, right? Or look at this language, data from Ladakh. A 10 times increase in population within 10 years and a 90% decrease in population within 10 years. Now, how do we explain these? These cannot be explained by demographic factors or other factors that we know which might affect language and other data, right? Or one of the final exhibits is from Nagaland, a decadal population growth rate of 50% plus for 3 decades, and then sudden decline to minus 0.58%. I mean, was there a sharp demographic transition? Of course, not the average child. The average number of children in families is still more than two for sure. So then how do we explain this? Or look at this data on income and consumption. Though I'm mostly going to confine myself on demography, but I still thought I'll give you one example from income and consumption. You see the sharp increase, even though the sharp increase in urban consumption, even though your per capita incomes are declining compared to rest of the country. So your urban consumption compared to rest of the country is increasing, whereas your per capita incomes are declining with respect to rest of the country. So therefore, so I would argue that sometimes researchers, when they look at the data, they believe that some of these sharp changes are characteristic of the underlying data generating process. In fact, this is what reminds me of an earlier misconception about output volatility being treated as a feature of African or developing economies, right? So we like to unpack these sharp changes and try to understand them and go beyond the just the statistical representation of these changes. So I'm going to argue that political processes intervene in a very big way in all this, and I'm going to give you examples from 5 different levels of aggregation in India. So let me first take you to a sub-district example. One of the villages in Nagaland, which used to be headhunting village, they believed that that they should enjoy a that they should that their dominance in that sub district is an historically inevitable fact. right? So therefore, the constituencies electoral list prepared by government officials should ensure that they have more votes, irrespective of whether they have more population or not. So therefore, the electoral roll was seen as an arena of status contest, and with the vote share being a reflection of the relative substantive power rather than being a simple list of the people who live there and who are above 18 years of age. Now often we see in these conflict areas certain numbers emerge as iconic numbers, right? So if you see at some initial stage you use numbers to prove your arguments, but after a point certain numbers emerge as icons, and people rally around them, right? And they become sacrosanct. For instance, in the state of Nagaland, it is argued that a 1953 unofficial plebiscite found that 99.99% people supported the independence, right? Now I have done extensive study here. Only a very small fraction of the population voted in this plebiscite, and so therefore this 99.9999% of the whole people of Nagaland or Naga people across many states, this is misleading. However, this is sacrosanct. Now you cannot uh, question this number. This number has become the argument itself. It is no longer used to support the argument that the Naga people are justified in claiming independence. This itself has become the argument. Or for instance, in Kashmir, the argument that I mean Kashmir, the arguments about human rights oppression are began to be supported by the claim that there is one soldier deployed for every 10 Kashmiris. Later, this became the argument itself. That this itself is proof. I mean, you don't talk about other things. Just the fact that this claim itself, proves everything else, right? Or in case of neighboring Bangladesh, they claim that 3 million people were killed by West Pakistani forces in the liberation war. Now the actual number is close to only 300,000. However, now this has become a sacrosanct figure. You cannot question this. Questioning this would amount to questioning the claim that Pakistan committed atrocities. This number is both the argument and its proof now. Right now we see, but going back to my example of that small village in Nagaland, you cherry pick certain points of departure in the history and build your argument with respect to that. It is not that this village always won all headhunting wars, but it chose a particular point in the history where it was supposed to be winning, and then you projects from there that forever it should be the dominant power in the region. Now look at a few sub districts. So this is an example from Manipur, where a community was for some reasons which was distant from the colonial headquarter, was clubbed with another community, right? So now to assert its independence, it has started to inflate its headcount, right? They say that you cannot decide what your future would be, but you can decide what your census would be, and therefore we'll fix the census, right? So therefore, to assert its independence, it is using, it is leaning on inflated numbers to show that we are a much larger community than the so-called parent community, and we should be identified separately, right? Or look at the case now of a district, of one of the most interesting cases I found in India. Right now, in there's this in a particular district of Nagaland, the Yimchungar tribe wants to subsume these tribes. It claims that these are part of the larger tribe. Right now, this is deeply debatable. Hundreds of people have lost their lives in this conflict, but but the way the Yamchungar people build their argument is extremely interesting. So they said, because in Nagaland it is believed that to be a separate tribe you have to have a separate language. So to claim that these people are a part of their tribe, they said that these are dialect groups only. They speak dialects of this language. Therefore, they should be treated as part of the Yamchungar tribe. And they steered the district gazetteers committee to give data on language-wise population rather than tribe-wise, because they knew that right from the beginning census gave tribe-wise data, but not tribe-wise data showed Tikir to be a separate tribe, but language-wise data showed Tikirs to be speakers of a dialect of Jimchungar. So therefore they insisted and also succeeded in making sure that the district gazetteer only reports language-wise population. Now the interesting thing is that this gazetteer came out in late 1970s, okay, and this happens to be after 1976. Before 1976, no matter how small you are, whether you are, all mother tongues were reported, right? Just as all tribes were reported. After 1976, the census reports only those languages with more than 10,000 speakers, and all other mother tongues are clubbed under these languages as dialects, or they are clubbed as miscellaneous languages. Therefore, now this person who did not have a formal education, who is the first, who's the first generation of his community to see contemporary statistics, he very quickly figured out how to manipulate that data and how to manipulate the representation of that data, right? So that's important for me. Now you can look at your provinces, regions within provinces, right? So Kashmir. Now Kashmir is a unique, demographically unique, because Muslims of Kashmir are required to share power as a minority at the national level and a majority at the state level. This perhaps is an unusual experience for Muslim community anywhere in the world. Right now the Hindu perspective is slightly different in this regard, right? Am I audible? Am I audible? Okay.
That
So
you
we,
can't
we
see the
still hear
presentation.
you, but your presentation somehow disappeared. Your
Okay, now
the
I'm going to
screen
I'm going to put
sharing
it
stopped.
Okay.
back on the screen.
Now
Yes.
we see it again.
uh,
We did it.
Great. Now the Hindus in turn say, well, Kashmir might be a minority in India. Kashmiri Muslims might be a minority in India, but Hindus are a minority in the larger world where Muslims and Christians are a majority. Right? So you see, everyone is trying to claim a minority status, and then build their political project on that. So within Kashmir, Hindus are a minority, right? But within India, the Muslims are a minority, and within the world, Hindus are a minority, right? Now, what has happened in Kashmir is that demographic change, or the threat of demographic change, has been used both by Hindus and Muslims as the touchstone of every public policy, every photograph, every road, every penny allocated, every ventilator allocated to different districts is seen from the perspective of how it is favoring community A or community B, how it might lead to demographic change, right? Now demography has been reduced to a political instrument, as a political ally. I'll just give you an example. In 2000 and 2001, when the census was being done, there was a struggle uh, between the armed and non-armed pro-independence groups. The armed groups attacked the non-armed groups for neglecting the threat to Muslim majority. Simultaneously, there was a conflict within the ruling party in the state, and one of the parliamentarians who were expelled by the ruling party, he said that the next census is going to be used to reduce the headcount of Muslims. Now, these two unrelated developments, idiosyncratic developments, converged to boycott calls against census and attacks on census workers. Now, this was not the first time when census was used by different groups to further their political project. In 1980, in the 1980s, when Sheikh Abdullah, who literally dominated the state for 50 years, after he died, there was an intense conflict between his son and son-in-law about who's going to succeed, and also between his party and other parties about who's going to be the next dominant political force. Again, the people who are on the losing side repeatedly use census and demographic change, the threat to Muslim majority, to drum up support for themselves. However, in the next census, 2010-11, the armed and non-armed independence groups, they converged, and they said that we need to protect the demographic advantage of Kashmir, which until then and even now enjoys a majority within the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So they gave a call to Kashmiri and Muslim enumerators to fulfill their duty towards the community. They called the Muslims to get enumerated rather than boycott the census, and they called non-Kashmiri speaking Muslims to report themselves as Kashmiri speaking Muslims. And all three of them have had an impact. I mean, you can see the impact of all three strands on the final census data. But something more interesting is that is the larger, I mean, that Kashmir, the same people who are opposing census now were supporting census. This is not an isolated, development. You see this development across the periphery in Nagaland as well as in Manipur. This is a larger shift in how communities in the periphery, and armed groups and non-armed groups in the periphery engage with numbers. There was a larger post-Cold War, post-economic liberalization shift, right? So in all these areas, the groups which were earlier attacking census and trying to disrupt census, and I'm going to explain why they were disrupting census in a short while. They started supporting census, and to be more specific, supporting their communities to get higher numbers in census, right? So therefore we saw this shift as an almost simultaneous shift across the periphery. Right. Now let us zoom up a little bit into the Kashmiri, the statistics. You saw that the child population share increased between these two dates. The child sex ratio decreased, right? And there was a sharp increase in slum population, urbanization, and there was a disjuncture between tribal population and the population of those who spoke tribal languages. And finally, a change. All these things, all these four, translated into an increase in Kashmir's relative population share within the state. Now, all these changes, as I've also noted earlier, were counterintuitive. One of the difficulties one finds in comparing in working on Kashmir census data is that there are multiple reference dates. They're different because of the difficult terrain and inclement weather and conflict. You have different districts, or even different parts of the same district maybe canvassed at different dates. Now this leads to a lot of difficulties in the state, and just to give you a well-known example of how the reference dates can affect census comparisons. In 1971, the Indian census was conducted 1 month later than the usual reference date. Right? This was due to the parliamentary elections. Now, almost all researchers overlook this fact and find the population growth rates, and they conclude that the highest growth rate was between 61 and 71. What they forget is that between 61 and 71 there were 121 months instead of 120 months, right? And between 1971 and 1981 there were 119 months. If you take this fact into account and recalculate the growth rates, Indian population growth peaked between 1971 and 1981, right? So in Kashmir, this problem is you face it across communities and across districts also. Now this is because there's a large mobile population in the state. So if you see this, there are nomadic communities which migrate from here to here, right? In the summers and come back in winter. So they migrate from here to here. They migrate from here to here, and they go. And this part is Kashmir. This part is Kashmir, largely Kashmir. This part is Jammu, the second part of the state. Now, because they migrate during these seasons. Now, if there is a change in the reference date, and if that change is linked to season, and conflict, you have no means of comparing population change, right? And then there's this boat population which moves between these districts, roughly these districts, right? There's this boat population. There's a forest labor population which moves between this part and this part, right? Then there are government officials who move between the summer and winter capital, right? Apart from that, there is forced migration due to domestic and international conflict. You have to be extraordinarily careful when comparing the data, even of the same district across censuses. Now, what I did was that I looked at all possible explanation, expanding reach of census, underreporting in the past, migration, deployment of armed forces, conflict and fertility, sex selective feticide, excess girl child mortality, drop in contraceptive uses, and increased fertility. All possible ways of looking at the census data, disaggregated by community, by district, by sub-region, and looking at data for single year age group, looking at age group, club data. Look at, no matter how you look at this, the change in population is difficult to explain. The only explanation that works out is the overcounting of children, particularly not probe this further. They simply hinted that it seems that instead of demographic factors, overcounting of children could be a factor. Now, the population was, as a result of overcounting of children, the population was overestimated by about 10% in Kashmir, and the sex ratio, because of overcounting of boys, it changed by very large, about 100 plus points, right? Now, so what happens, and as Bashir Bhatt explains, the enumerator served as the link between the Kashmiri elite discourse on imminent adverse demographic change directed by New Delhi and the everyday concerns of people on the grassroots concerned about, securing more ration and other social welfare, benefits. We can also say that triggered by the elite discourse, that you are manipulating to make sure that you win the referendum whenever it is conducted in future, to decide whether the province will become a separate country or not. And the defensive manipulation affected by people. See, people who had already manipulated their data in ration card and so many other sources, they wanted to make sure that the census reflected this, so they were defending the earlier manipulation, right? And though the census is not linked to any other database, but people don't understand this, because the same official comes to enroll them in electoral rolls, right? The same official comes to enroll them in ration cards, and the same official also comes to enroll them in census, right? Now, they don't understand that in these three activities, this official has three different legal identities or personalities, and these three legal personalities cannot talk to each other, but they believe that is the same person, so they have to maintain parity across all these databases, right? Now, after the census data were published, the interpretation of data was also driven by partisan considerations. The Kashmiri Muslims focused only on the poor child sex ratio, I should say sex ratio, whereas as an area of concern, whereas the Hindu nationalists, they focused on the growing share of children among Muslims, to buttress the argument that Muslims are a fast growing community and they are a threat to the Hindus of the country, right? And whereas the Kashmiri Muslims ignored the growing share of child population, because that would have undercut their increasing demographic dominance as reflected in the census, right? So what we see is that there's a political economy of errors, right? You to access development funding and affirmative action benefits, you make sure that the reported headcounts and measured socioeconomic disadvantage is manipulated to to your benefit. You similarly manipulate data to make sure that the demarcation of administrative units and delimitation of electoral constituencies is in your favor. Kashmir is concerned about the fact that, I mean, if the Hindu population increases and their constituencies increase, so maybe the next chief minister will not be Muslim, right? And similarly, Hindus are concerned about that if the Muslim population increases, they will never have a chance to become the chief minister of the province. Now, when people are making intervention, and this is extremely important, they are driven by efficiency considerations. In 2011, when there was no threat of delimitation, that is redistricting of electoral constituencies, the manipulations focused only on child population statistics, both in Kashmir and Manipur. But in 2001, when delimitation was the issue at hand, people manipulated the adult population, not the child population, right? Right? You manipulate the tribes population, but not their languages, because the demarcation or the identification of tribal electoral constituencies depends on percentage tribal population, not the percentage of tribal languages, right? Second thing is that the manipulation is more where the constituency size is less, because the marginal value of manipulation is high. The manipulation is higher in districts and sub districts which are farther from urban areas, which are farther from the main roads, where there's a larger population which depends on government subsidies, where the private sector of the economy is extremely small or non-existent, and where, because of distance, the government finds it difficult to cross-examine the data, right? Uh, but I would like to highlight some other aspects as well. See, so far we have been looking at tangible reasons to manipulate or not manipulate. I would like to now add a meta context to this, namely the initial conditions when statistics were introduced in your area. 1920s, 1930s, Kashmir and Nagaland saw the first move towards using numbers in public discourse to support political positions. Now, this was also the time when the Basque supporters produced atlases and statistics to support their claims. However, there's a difference between Kashmir and Nagaland on one hand and the Basque people on the other hand. Kashmir and Nagaland saw statistics for the first time only in the political arena. They did not have experience of statistics in chemistry, in economics, and different areas. They saw only statistics for the first time when it came to political contestation, whereas the Basque people saw statistics in very many other contexts. So you don't see manipulation of statistics in Basque land. You see manipulation of statistics in Kashmir and Nagaland, even though they started using statistics for political purposes around the same time. I'd like to add three other points. Statistics have been seen as insignia of modernity. So if the third world countries are underdeveloped, and poor quality statistics are an indication of that underdevelopment, right? They are both the cause and consequence of that underdevelopment. So third world countries are deeply conscious of this, and they want to somehow produce statistics, right? So China wanted to erase the shame of national humiliation, as one observer puts it, the shame of national humiliation of not knowing about not having a statistical understanding of itself. So in these conditions, conducting a census, becomes the end in itself, rather than means to know something else, right? Because you know that there's so many ethnic conflicts that you cannot use the census data. Now, because you see statistics and as an in itself, and you see statistics as a means to proclaim your sovereignty. So those who want to disrupt your sovereignty, they find it easy to disrupt census and point out that you are not sovereign here, right? Or you want to, I mean, India as a post and very anxious post-colonial society wants to project its collective, picture as a happy coexistence of communities. So those communities which challenge the national project, they also intervene in census to disrupt it, right? Now, sometimes the union government does not mind these communities disrupting or manipulating data to project a higher population share of themselves, because then it is able to prove to the world that the minorities are not ill-treated. Look, their population is increasing. How can you say that they are being ill-treated in the secular democracy of India? I'm not going into the detailed statements which I produce in some of my forthcoming work, where I show that this is indeed the case. So when you look at the government statistics of India, for instance, that will be true for many other developing countries, you see smoothly varying series at the national level, but these your series are actually made up of these so many of these erratically varying subcomponents, right? So my trust in these national level data is deeply undermined by these different slides here, right? And a lot of committees do not look at this context, let alone the meta context, and they formulate wrong policies here after another. I've just given you a few samples here. I'm not going to go into academic, examples of how data have been blatantly misused over so many decades without looking at the context of that data. Right now, I'm going to just wind up in the next 3 to 5 minutes. Several observers in different, from economics, have suggested that the researchers are either not aware of, or worse, have chosen to ignore the fact that the published data suffer from serious conceptual problems. Or scholars who are best equipped to analyze the validity and reliability of economic statistics are often data users themselves, and are thus reluctant to undermine the data sets that are the bread and butter of scholarly work, right? And Jervan makes this argument after a lot of field research across Africa and the first world, right? Hartwig says that, for instance, that the field of political economy statistics is a largely unknown terrain, right? Right? Or for instance, Philipson says that since the 1970s, the national account files from the archives, Library of Congress, National Archives, were not checked even once, even though during the same period the Kennedy files were checked thousands of times, right? Now I'm not going to get into the gaps in university curriculum, textbooks, and training which explain these three observations, but these are not confined only to economics. Political scientists and demographers have also voiced similar concerns, right? There's something else also, the fact that that either people uncritically use data, or they use data by excluding the problematic areas. Now, if you're narrowing down your focus to questions which can be answered statistically, and you're not paying attention to areas that do not give good quality statistics, you are actually ignoring a lot of causal relationships, which you ought to take care of, right? And so therefore a geographically limited discipline will find it difficult to detect some of these difficult to quantify variations in cultural factors, for instance, right? So I'll just give you I think one or two last slides, and then I want to engage with everyone here. So if you look at the government statistics, most of the economists focus here, right? Uh, d- Demographers focus on this part, or this part of it, right? um, this part, the demographers, statisticians, anthropologists, and other disciplines, they focus on this part of it, right? What is needed is that we need someone who takes care of the larger, looks at the overall life cycle of statistics, and understands how different pushes and pulls define shape statistics at different stages. There are many instances in developing world where statistics change after data processing, or there are many instances where statistics change after collection, after processing, even after publication, or at the stage of policy making. So unless, or when they come out in the public sphere, so unless we take into account the entire life cycle, we will really look at we'll have we won't be able to understand data quality completely, right? What we have is a missing discipline, some of the other social sciences look at politically salient statistics, but they largely ignore economic statistics. And even there, where they look at politically salient statistics, they look at content errors, but coverage errors are more important for economic analysis. But in any case, economics does not, as a discipline, does not use the insights of these other disciplines, right? What we have is missing is the discipline of field economics, or an anthropology of statistics, right? If there were field economists who first checked their data on the ground and then did the analysis, they'll find that ethnostatistical entrepreneurship, people working to somehow mold statistics in favor of their communities, that is a very large economic activity in some of the societies, right? I have not yet, done an analysis of, I'm still, working on that, looking at what fraction of manpower and resources are tied down to ethnostatistical entrepreneurship. Some of my new work is actually looking at that, right? And that there could be political economy errors, and that people economize their efforts when they manipulate numbers. When they go out in the field and look at and remove the statistical screen which now stands between them and the field, they'll find the statistics are intertwined with the reality that they are supposed to capture. Statistics are not generated by a distant, unseen satellite in the space. Statistics are integral to the everyday, are an integral part of the economic and social world which they seek to, describe. So when we look at the head count, we should not, instead of rushing to be the first to publish paper on this newly released data, we should allow us, time to meander into this larger family of factors which affect that head count, right? And by doing this, we will make room for a much richer, economic analysis. With this, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for patiently listening to my talk.
Well, thank you very much.
Vikas, could you summarize your main point? I mean, what are you saying? That statistics are manipulated, or that they're
Yes,
used for political purposes? That
they're
they're not
both
telling the
used.
truth? Is this your point?
Uh, Statistics in large parts of the developing world are manipulated with an eye on subsequent political uses, political and economic uses. So I know that the next census will be used for delimiting constituencies. So I manipulate the head count so that my community or my district or my region gets a higher head, representation in the census, and thereby in the subsequent delimitation of seats. Now this is a problem which affects very large parts of the developing world.
Okay,
Now,
I understand now. It's
yeah,
more of a
after
problem in a democracy. It's more of a problem in a democracy than in autocracy,
right.
because
So
people
for
vote.
instance, yeah.
Okay,
So,
okay.
for instance, after 1961, Nigeria has not been able to conduct any census, proper census, and they keep on reproducing the older population shares. I don't understand how in 70 years you keep on doing censuses which give you the same population shares. In Pakistan, after 1981, they have not been able to conduct, impartial censuses, and they largely keep on reproducing the old population shares, right? In some parts of India, people protested when the census showed a different population share than a historical population share. So people manipulate, and you are right that this could be part. partly linked to the way democracy has worked in the, I mean, democracy operates in the third world.
Okay, if there's another comment, then I will start. Well, I think, this population problem is a multidimensional problem, because there is not just that population. You have young ones, you have old ones, you have female, you have male, and all that. So we have actually an aggregation problem, And
Yes.
now, of course, if you have this aggregation problem, there's a kind of leeway of making choices. But of course, now you can exaggerate, so to say, these choices, because this leeway, of course, reduces the control from an outsider. And then and then manipulation starts when you sort of say, well, I take this dimension and only look at that one, for some time, and then forget the rest about, This is then the manipulation. But it's in a way pretty similar, what we have very often in a democratic decision process. And it just dawned to me, there's some arrow paradox behind, in a way, in this aggregation. And people use this idea, there's a paradox or there's an aggregation problem which we cannot solve. And they use it, and then they use it to manipulate, so that the outcome is, so to say, in their way. This is it's very interesting. Of course, I read your Nagaland paper. By the way, Vikas, the printed version appeared today. So the printed version of your paper came out today. And I will send it, of course, to you an issue. So yeah, I think this is the general problem of this kind of statistics, that you have actually a multidimensional problem.
But is this a form of corruption, Manfred?
Yes.
Is this corruption? I'll let somebody else talk.
Well, it gives an opportunity of corruption, let's say. If the statistics would be only one line always, one dimension, then of course you could have more control on that, But we want to have a richer statistics, we want to look at many dimensions, do we?
No, I just add a small point in response to the observation on corruption. A lot of these societies see faulty data when you point it out to them. Then they invariably say, we are ashamed of this. We are ashamed that the whole world sees us corrupt people. I mean, these countries or these small regions with nobody in the West even knows of, they believe that the West is seeing them, and by producing this faulty data, they have been shamed on the international stage, right? And a lot of the post manipulation discussions are burdened by a sense of shame, a sense of guilt, etc.
You have a hand,
Yeah,
Ron.
Ron, please.
Yeah, can I?
Well, Peter, you're next then, huh? Okay, but you're mute.
So, isn't this problem a problem we have about all sources of information today, in particular, that it's been growing lately in the last 10 years or so? So you have more and more people from different political points of view having different sources of information and believing entirely different things. So the most silliest example in a way is the January 6th riot in the United States that took place at the Capitol, where there was, everyone saw it on TV, and yet somehow in the world of the right, it's become reinterpreted as something else entirely. And almost any piece of information I can think of nowadays in a polarized society like the US, less so here in Canada, and I don't know what the situation is in different parts of Europe, but it's all much more subject to different viewpoints and manipulation than before. I guess the interesting thing about statistics is you tend to think they're real. You just think a statistic, well, there's a number. So that at least is a fact. But what you're saying is that that's not true about statistics either. And so our last hope for true information is gone in a way.
If you look at the work of Donald Horowitz, when he explains the manipulation of census in third world, he also gives examples from first world saying why statistics are not manipulated there. So his argument was that there is no clear polarization. So for instance, in Belgium or Netherlands, you could be ethnically polarized, but then but you could belong to the same political party, right? In many parts of the third world, your ethnic polarization and political polarization are coterminous, right? So you have much harder polarization. Now, I guess the example that you give from America, we are seeing a deeper polarization of the American society, perhaps, and therefore now every fact is being subject to politicization.
Well, Peter, you have a question, yeah? Comment?
Yeah, thank you, Manfred. I just want to point out this extraordinary fact that in 1947, I think it was, the United Nations passed a resolution saying that the problem of Kashmir should be resolved in a referendum.
Yes.
Thank God it has never happened, because any sort of yes, no, we win, you lose type vote would almost inevitably lead to a horrible bloodbath. And we have this crazy situation where so many people in the world, in India and in Europe and in the United Nations and everywhere, they tend to think that a majority vote is an accurate way of assessing the popular will, which is just nonsense.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
In fact,
this
you
is
know,
what I
in fact, the
expected.
Kashmiri Muslims often cite the UN referendum, which is going to happen at some point of time in future, as the reason why they have to ensure that their majority status has to be maintained at any cost. Right? So that 1947 resolution is being used on a daily basis in newspaper editorials, political speeches. The United Nations has itself forgotten that resolution, but the people have not forgotten it, and that has been a major flashpoint between the Hindus and Muslims, and Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, and Muslims and this. It's been a complete chaos there, and you are right that if they had indeed implemented that, there would have been further bloodbath in that region.
Shanti, you wanted to comment? Shanti?
Well, there are two separate issues. I think when you collect data, there is nothing called data that is absolutely sacrosanct. Mistakes can be made. And when you collect data with a purpose in mind, what you're talking about is the purpose in mind, because big errors occur in data which is collected quite often without any such manipulation in mind. To witness, for instance, we get something called a public expenditure white paper, which is a very thick book, and a tiny public sector expenditure red book at the time of the budget. Now, if you look at the data, sometimes you find that even the direction, the slope of expenditure is different. Now, somebody I knew asked the Treasury about it. They said, well, look, the big book has to be sent to the printer 2.5 months before. Secondly, they use survey prices. For some reason, it's a different way of calculating inflation, whereas the little booklet that is produced is much more up to date and uses GDP deflator for surveys. For some, again, why it uses different things, I do not know. So it seems to have created this problem. So we'll look into it. Now, and now, anybody who works with data would probably tell you that you do not use very recent data for time series analysis, because very recent data would have errors, not because somebody is deliberately making it wrong. And there is inherent in the data collection process that there would be quite often quite big statistical errors. What you're talking about is a process where you think the data collection is being manipulated. Not you talk only about the communities, but also by government.
Yes,
Because the
yes.
central government in India, now that it is very focused on India being Hindu, would probably mess about with data collection in Kashmir before the elections there. I mean, the state government, if delimitation may not occur, but state government in UP might be very tempted. West Bengal might be tempted. But what you have to do is not to look at all these things as a single thing. First of all, if you're going to provide a critique of data, one is the kind of errors that are inevitable and ways of correcting it. The other is to focus on the specific rent-seeking opportunities, how they might have manipulated. And what's more interesting is that when you go about rent-seeking, you may have cross-cutting cleavages in your interest. So you do one type of manipulation for a particular purpose to find that another purpose is frustrated. So if you can bring that out, some of the internal contradictions, even within rent seeking, and B, separating rent seeking from inevitable nature of errors in statistics, that might be much more focused and much more interesting.
So in my Kashmir work, I do show the cross-cutting considerations. In the Kashmir work, I do show cross-cutting consideration that when you manipulate A, then you also have to manipulate B, but B goes against
Yeah.
interest of the community which is manipulating. There's something interesting which you pointed out about this central government. See, there's a very complex dynamic here because the central government wants. I mean, the Muslim population share of Kashmir began to grow under Hindu nationalist central government. Because the central government does not mind an increase in Muslim population share if it can show to the world that this is how well we are treating them. In fact, one of the senior officials and politicians publicly said so that Muslims are doing well under BJP because their population is growing. However, the rank and file sees the same number, that is the increase in population of Muslims, as a threat to Hindus, right? So the party has to do a very, have to tell one thing to the rank and file and one thing to the international community. And how they manage to do it is something that only they can do it. Because they have to use the same set of published
Yeah, or sometimes the
data
internal contradictions can bring about the
for
demise
two
of
different
those that are
purposes.
seeking rent.
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? No, if not, then thank you very much, Vikas, for your presentation, for your enlightenments. And Shanti, wonderful introduction.
Manfred, there's
And
another question, I think, from Andreas.
Yes.
There was another question from Andreas.
there was a question.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I couldn't see you.
If we have time, can you hear me? Yes.
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 My I worked at the Federal Statistics in Wiesbaden 20 years ago, and actually I found the your talk very interesting. But my question is very provocative. Do you have any reliable statistics at all from which you can start? Or do you question all the statistics that are produced and published by those authorities? If that's the case, you are in a very miserable situation, because if you don't have any reliable sources, you cannot make any reliable comparisons to other sources. In Germany, we do have very different sources from statistics, like text statistics, federal statistics, population statistics. Though you easily, in a time frame from a couple of years, you check out whether there are problems with these statistics at all. You have bank statistics and very different sources. So my question to your complete essay is, where are the reliable statistics from which you can to start to make serious, well, either explorations or studies at all? So to make it more concrete, do you have birth statistics? From where are births reported? Do you have death statistics? Are the sources of death also by the ICD-10 code documented? Are these reports different from those reports who are doing the surveys or doing the consensus? So my question is, isn't there an interference between very different authorities, so that I conclude really on a very general, you might laugh at it, you can manipulate all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. That would my conclusion. If you look at your statistics at all, there might be so many errors and betrayal and fraud, but in the medium run, there are sources that you can detect those errors and manipulations, at least in democratic societies. And that is a very strong purpose for democratic societies. Look at these scandals like Diesel or Wirecard. They turn out after a while because you have different agencies looking with different interests at those real figures. And therefore, you do have reliable sources in the medium run. Not every year, not every month, but within a decade, I would say you can rely on this. Even the Greek government has betrayed the EU for several years, but it turned out to came out. So you started in a very long horizon from 19, I think, 47 was already mentioned. That is 50 or 60 years. So my question is, in Germany, we publish long time series, even in national account, in demographics and banking statistics and tax statistics. Isn't there anything like that? Or are we really such a mess that you cannot rely on everything? Then I would say, turn out the light and go to another country, because this is a terrible situation.
See, we have multiple agencies, and the way the founding fathers of India structured the statistical enterprise, device. This was a three-tier, the national, state, and the local, level, right? So they envisaged this, and they put in place cross-cutting agencies which would collect data on overlapping subjects and areas. Now, this very feature helps us to identify these errors, right? We, for instance, I know that the communities which are going after data manipulation to win the next referendum, they will not manipulate the sample survey, because the sample survey data will not be used for deciding how many people will be eligible to vote, right? So then the sample registration survey gives us an idea about the infant mortality, child mortality, etc., right? And it gives you data by age specific units, right? Or there is a national family and health survey. Now the national family health survey is serious problems. However, when you look at the the data generated over 3 decades, the broad directions are clear, and you can rely on that for the direction of change, right? So I use these sources not often for the point estimates, but for the direction of change. So when the direction of change in these census and all these surveys are contradicting each other, so in that case I say that there is a reason for us to probe deeper. Then I try to compare the point estimates as well. Now, the fact that you mentioned very important point that democracies, this cannot be hidden for long. This is exactly the thing that happens. That India has a right to information act, in which people are entitled to access most of the data that is not national security, right? So national security will be nuclear power, nuclear energy, etc., etc. Of course, the, the government often tries to put national security label on anything and everything. Then people go to courts, and then the court forces the government to declare that. So we have, in a democracy, your government statistics are public good because everyone can access them, right? And there are the other reasons also by the qualify as public goods. One of the things that I do in my work is that because I know that the moment I say that the data has so many flaws. In fact, if I quote Stanley Professor, he says that there is nothing like data collection. We always construct data. I mean, he goes to that extent, Stanley Professor. But the point is that I argue that I say, well, I completely agree with this. However, when human beings are constructing data, there is a pattern there. So, for instance, when you ask an Indian to inflate his household size, and you tell him that the easiest way to do is to add non-existent children, even for the non-existent children, he wants them to be a boy because of the strong son preference. So you see, whenever you are manipulating just to inflate head count, you add more boys, right? So therefore, it is indeed true that all data are constructed, but human beings are constructing that, and there's a pattern. And I go after the pattern after extensive field work, and then I come back to the archival sources and say, well, this is how things have gone wrong. So every time I point out a mistake, I make it a point that I give my audience a upper bound and a lower bound, an upper bound and a lower bound of what could be the corrected statistics, and I give detailed explanations why I believe that these have to be corrected in this or that way. One of the reasons why we feel particularly miserable in India at this point of time is that the Indian statistical system was put in place in 1950s, when it was a planned economy where the mobility rates were low. Now, after 1991, after the liberalization of the economy and weakening of state control, the society has become much more complex and dynamic. Now, the old statistical methods put in place, which were put in place in 1950s, are no longer helpful. However, because of the growing and deepening political polarization, it has become impossible to arrive at a new consensus for a new statistical system. And in absence of serious statistical reforms and greater dynamism and change in the country, we are still working with the old systems, and we are multiplying mistakes, right? So this is one of the reasons. So if we can somehow address this collective action problem on in the parliament to put in place new statistical machinery, I think most of our, I mean, India can still produce very good statistics, right? So some of the problems are in my opinion, transient in nature, though the transition phase has already been 3 decades long. In fact, in 2001, the National Statistical Commission, produced a new report on how to set the system right, but there has been a lack of political consensus on how to implement it. So I agree with you that that there are problems, but as responsible academics, what we do is we not only point out the problems like anthropologists or others, we also go a step ahead and give you estimates that these are the things with which you can work with. And for instance, in all my work, whether Kashmir or whether it is anything, I give them estimates and I say that you can do, but then I say that the statistical agencies of India, we do not give the margin of error. You should give out the margin of error, saying that this is the band of variation, and you can work with different scenarios of high statistics, low statistics, etc., etc. Unfortunately, that is not happening at present.
Mhm. Okay. So we ended up in a very important discussion whether there can be democracy without reliable data, basically. A friend of mine, called Pierre Guy de Montou, he has written a paper entitled There is no Accounting in Utopia. He looked at various utopias, for instance, Thomas More's utopia, and then I remember Campanella's Sunshine State and things. There was never even an accounting, not to talk about a statistical office. But of course, they were not democracies. They were utopias, and they were structured in a completely different way. I mean, if you read Thomas More's utopia, it's a dreadful surrounding, it's not democracy. Okay, this was, I know.
In 1925, Ernst Wagemann published an article, Die Konjunktur ein Rechenfehler, and that was already at the beginning of the discussion of reliable statistics in the national accounts, not to speak of democracy. So thank you very much for your comment.
Yeah, but anyway, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I think I studied, no, more than 50 years ago, we were always thinking about whether the business cycle, is actually due to
exactly.
errors. Really, that was very serious at that time, at least the short run one. And then there were the long waves and all this kind of waves. Okay, thank you very much, Vikas and Shanti.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And Mario says goodbye. Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Gregor,
Well, thank you, Gregor, for all the help.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.